The day started like any other. I remember it so vividly, the routine that felt comforting in its repetition. I left work at 5:30, just like always, stopping by the grocery store to pick up the ingredients for Mark's favorite dinner: garlic, tomatoes, fresh pasta. I'd planned to make his favorite bolognese, the kind he raved about to our friends. As I hauled the bags up the stairs to our apartment on the 3rd floor, I felt a strange heaviness. Maybe it was the bags. Maybe it was something deeper. Looking back, I think some part of me knew what was coming. The signs had been there for months. Late-night work meetings, the texts he'd quickly hide when I entered the room, the slight distance in his eyes when he looked at me. But I'd ignored them, convincing myself that marriage was like that sometimes, that it ebbed and flowed. I struggled with the key in the lock, my hands trembling slightly as I turned it. The door swung open, and I was immediately hit by the silence. Too quiet. Normally, Mark would be in the living room, the TV murmuring softly in the background, or on the phone talking work. But today, there was nothing. Just silence. I shrugged it off, assuming he was in the bedroom or the shower. I kicked off my shoes, my feet sore from the day, and carried the bags to the kitchen, already mentally preparing dinner. But as I started unpacking, I heard something. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of our bedroom. A woman's voice. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again, this time clearer. Sarah could come home any minute. My heart hammered in my chest as I crept closer to the bedroom door. The handle felt cold against my palm as I pressed my ear against the wood. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts swirling all at once, but none of them could prepare me for what I was about to hear. "Monica, you need to leave." Mark's voice came through, sharp with urgency. "Sarah has no idea. If she finds out, everything falls apart." Monica. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Monica, his mistress. A woman I had no idea existed until this very moment. My stomach churned, and I had to bite my lip to keep from gasping. How long had this been going on? How many times had I been this close to the truth without even knowing? I clenched my fists, nails digging into my palms as I stood outside that door, every fiber of my being screaming at me to burst in and confront him, to scream, to shout, to demand answers. But something held me back. I wasn't ready for the confrontation. Not yet. I needed to hear it all. "I don't understand why you're so scared of her, Mark," Monica's voice said, filled with casual amusement. "It's not like she's going to do anything." "What's she going to do?" "Kick you out." A bitter laugh escaped me, though it never left my throat. If only Monica knew. If only he knew. "She could," Mark replied, his voice tight. "This is her apartment, remember? If she finds out, I'll lose everything." "You don't get it. Sarah's smart. She won't just sit there and cry. She'll act." "Then why stay?" Monica countered, sounding bored, like she had asked him this 100 times before. "Why not just leave her already? You've got me. Isn't that what you want?" There was a pause, long and heavy. I could picture Mark on the other side of the door, running a hand through his hair like he always did when he was stressed. "It's not that simple," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "We have the kids, the apartment, our finances. If I leave now, it's a mess. But once I sell this place, everything will be different. I'll have the money, and we can start fresh. Just give me a little more time." I had to grab onto the wall to steady myself. He wanted to sell the apartment? My apartment? The one I had bought before we were married? How could he think he could sell something that wasn't even his? Fury boiled beneath my skin, but I bit my lip harder, forcing myself to stay silent. Monica laughed again, a soft, mocking sound. "Fine, Mark, but you better make it quick. I'm not waiting around forever." There it was, the ultimatum. I could hear the smugness in her voice, the confidence that she held all the cards. She thought she was winning. They both did. But as I stood there, the anger inside me transformed into something colder, sharper. I wasn't going to burst in there and give them the satisfaction of a dramatic confrontation. No, that would be too easy, too predictable. Instead, I turned and quietly walked back to the kitchen. My hands shook as I finished putting away the groceries. I went through the motions, my mind racing, calculating my next steps. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let them take my life, my children's future, not without a fight. And so, I made my decision. I wouldn't say a word, not yet. I'd act like everything was normal, like I hadn't heard a thing. I'd let Mark believe he was safe, let him think he had time. But all the while, I would be planning. And when the moment was right, I'd take back everything he thought he could steal from me. I left the apartment that night, the sound of their laughter still ringing in my ears. But something had shifted inside me. I was no longer the naive wife who believed in the sanctity of our marriage. I was a woman with a plan. And I would win. That night, as I lay in the bed next to Mark, I stared at the ceiling, my mind spinning like a carousel. His soft, rhythmic breathing, the sound that had once brought me comfort, now filled me with revulsion. Every breath he took felt like a lie, as though his entire existence had been a fabrication I'd willingly accepted for far too long. But I didn't move. I didn't confront him. I just lay there, pretending to be the same dutiful wife he believed me to be, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Inside, I was coiled tight like a spring, waiting for the right moment to snap back. I knew I had to be careful. One wrong move, one misstep, and everything could unravel. This wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. About protecting my children, my future. Mark thought he had the upper hand, that he could quietly sell our apartment and move on with his life, dragging Monica along with him. But what he didn't know was that I was already several steps ahead of him. The next morning, I put on my usual mask, the loving wife, smiling over breakfast, asking him about his day, pretending that nothing was wrong. Mark didn't suspect a thing. Why would he? I had never been one for confrontation. I had always been the one to smooth things over, to keep the peace. But this time, I wasn't going to keep the peace. I was going to shatter it. As I sipped my coffee, my mind was already forming the plan. I needed to make him think everything was fine, that I was still on his side, that we were still the same couple planning a future together. I needed him to trust me, to believe that I was completely unaware of his betrayal. That was the only way I could pull this off. "Mark, I've been thinking," I said casually, watching him over the rim of my mug. "Maybe we should look into getting a bigger place." His eyes flicked up from his phone, and I saw the flicker of surprise in them. I knew I had caught him off guard. He hadn't expected me to bring this up. "A bigger place," he repeated, as if testing the waters. "Yeah," I continued, keeping my tone light and breezy. "I mean, the kids are growing, and this apartment is starting to feel a little cramped. It would be nice to have more space, don't you think?" I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. He was wondering if I somehow knew, if I had overheard something. But then I saw him relax, a slow smile creeping across his face as he realized this was playing right into his hands. "You know, I've been thinking the same thing," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We should definitely look into it. Maybe I can talk to a realtor this week." "That would be great," I said, smiling back, even though I wanted to spit in his face. "I trust you to handle it." And there it was, the lie. The bait. I had given him exactly what he wanted. The illusion that I was clueless, that I trusted him implicitly. I knew he would run with it. He would think he had me wrapped around his finger, that I was too blind to see the truth. But behind my smile, I was already making my own moves. That afternoon, I made my first call. I contacted a real estate agent, one that Mark didn't know about, someone I trusted. We met in a small cafe on the other side of town, far away from any prying eyes or ears. I explained the situation to her in hushed tones, keeping my voice low, my hands steady. "I need to sell the apartment," I told her, quietly, no fuss, no complications. "And I need to buy a new one, but not in my name." The agent raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Why not in your name?" "Because if it's in my name, my husband will find a way to get his hands on it," I replied, my voice cold. "And that's not going to happen." She didn't ask any more questions. Instead, she nodded and assured me she could make it happen. The apartment would be listed under the radar, and once it was sold, the money would be used to purchase a new property that would be registered in my mother's name. It was the perfect solution. Mark would never be able to touch it. I walked out of that cafe feeling a strange sense of calm. I had a plan now, a solid one. But that was only the first step. At home, I played the role of the perfect wife with precision. I cooked his favorite meals, smiled at his stupid jokes, and even initiated conversations about our future together. Each time, I watched him closely, noting the way his shoulders relaxed, the way his guard came down. He truly believed I had no idea. He had no clue I was slowly tightening the noose around him. Meanwhile, I dug deeper. I began quietly going through his emails, his messages, his bank statements. I wanted to know everything. Every secret, every hidden account, every lie he had told. It didn't take long to find out just how deep his betrayal went. The money he'd promised Monica, it wasn't just talk. He had been siphoning funds from our joint account, planning to use it for their new life together. The realization hit me like a slap to the face. How many times had I looked at that account and trusted that he was handling things for us, for our family? How many times had I been the fool? But no more. I took notes, carefully logging every transaction, every discrepancy. I was building my case, piece by piece, knowing that when the time came, I would use it to destroy him. The hardest part was pretending nothing had changed. Every time he touched me, I wanted to recoil. Every time he looked at me with those deceitful eyes, I had to remind myself to stay calm, to be patient. This wasn't about reacting emotionally. It was about thinking strategically. One night, after the kids were in bed, he casually mentioned that he had found a buyer for the apartment. "We're almost there," he said, grinning like a man who thought he had everything under control. "In a few weeks, we'll have the down payment for the new place. Everything's falling into place." I smiled back, my heart racing in my chest. He had no idea the apartment was already sold. He had no idea that the money was already gone, tucked away in an account he couldn't touch. "That's great," I said, keeping my voice steady. I can't wait. And I couldn't, because soon Mark would realize that the future he was so eagerly planning wasn't his. It was mine. Mark had no idea how close he was to the edge of the cliff. Watching him operate, so smug and self-assured, was almost amusing, if it hadn't been so infuriating. He thought he was playing me like a fiddle, but little did he know I was the one holding the strings. I had been careful, meticulous. The sale of the apartment was underway, the papers signed and sealed in the hands of my real estate agent. I had my mother's name lined up for the purchase of our new place, and Mark, blissfully unaware, continued weaving his web of lies. But while I was orchestrating my escape, Mark was spinning his own narrative, this time with his mistress, Jessica. I knew he would turn to her for the money he needed to buy the new apartment, just as I knew how he'd manipulate her into giving it. He'd weave a story about their future, about how they'd be together once we sold our place. Of course, to Jessica, it wasn't just an apartment. It was their ticket to freedom for me. I could almost picture the scene when Mark approached her, Jessica, hanging on every word, looking at him with wide, naive eyes as he told her everything she wanted to hear. It was sickening. I knew what was coming, and I was more than ready for it. One evening after dinner, Mark looked at me with a strange expression on his face, the kind of look a man gives when he's trying to hide something. He was playing with the rim of his glass, fidgeting in a way that made me wonder if his little scheme was about to surface. "I've been thinking," he said casually, glancing at me over his wine glass. "Maybe we should push forward with the apartment sale sooner rather than later. You know, get the down payment ready so we don't miss out on a good deal." I nodded, feigning interest as I stirred my drink. "That sounds smart," I replied. "But where are we going to get the extra money? We both know we're a little short on what we need." He shifted in his chair, his smile tightening. "I've actually been working on that." "Have you?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do tell." There was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was testing the waters, wondering how much I knew. But when I simply smiled at him, Waiting for him to continue, he seemed to relax a bit, taking another sip of his wine before leaning back in his chair. "I've got some help lined up," he said, his voice smooth. "A friend is going to lend us the rest, just enough to get us over the line. Once we sell the place, it'll all be sorted." I nearly laughed out loud. A friend? He couldn't even say her name to my face, couldn't even acknowledge the person who was supposed to be my replacement. It was pathetic, really. "That's great," I said, keeping my tone light. "Who's this friend?" "Anyone I know." He stiffened for a second, then chuckled, shaking his head. No, just someone I've worked with in the past. It's not a big deal. She's someone who believes in the investment." "An investor," I said, nodding as though I bought into his lie. "How lucky for us." "Yeah," he said, glancing at his watch. "Lucky." Later that week, I watched as Mark became more desperate to solidify his plan with Jessica. I could sense the tension building. He knew he was running out of time. The more pressure he put on her to get the money, the more cracks started to show in his carefully constructed facade. I imagined him sitting across from her, feeding her promises like a starving dog, telling her how everything would be perfect once they had the apartment. She believed him, of course. Why wouldn't she? He had built their future out of sweet nothings, each word designed to make her feel special, to make her feel like she was the center of his world. I, on the other hand, had been slowly gathering the truth, picking apart his lies. Every evening, I would sneak into his phone, looking through the messages he exchanged with her. They were painfully predictable. Mark telling her how much he missed her, how much better their lives would be once we got rid of the old place and started fresh. He made it sound like we were both on the same page, like I was in on the plan to sell the apartment and leave the past behind. But what really made me laugh was how hard he had to work to keep Jessica on the hook. She was starting to lose patience with him. It was clear from her messages that she had been waiting long enough. She wanted action. She wanted to move in with him, to have a home that was theirs, not something tied to me. She wanted her future with Mark, and the longer he dragged his feet, the more agitated she became. One particular evening, Mark came home late, his usual excuse about being caught up at work hanging in the air like a stale joke. He walked in, rubbing his temples, a deep frown etched across his face. "Rough day?" I asked, sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine as though I hadn't noticed the hour. He sighed dramatically, collapsing into the armchair across from me. "You could say that." I watched him closely. He was unraveling. The stress was starting to show. Tightened jaw, clenched fists. Jessica must have been pushing him harder, maybe even threatening to pull out of the deal. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Anything you want to talk about?" I offered, trying to sound sympathetic. He shook his head, staring at the floor. "No, it's nothing. Just work stuff. You know how it is." I did. I knew exactly how it was. But instead of pushing him, I let it go, watching as he pulled himself together. He didn't know it yet, but the walls were closing in. Every move he made, every lie he told, was driving him deeper into the trap I'd set. The following morning, I woke up to find him already dressed and pacing the kitchen. His phone was pressed to his ear, his voice low and urgent. "I just need you to trust me, okay?" I heard him say, his back turned to me. "This is all going to work out. You'll get your money back, I promise." Ah, so it was Jessica. He was pulling out all the stops now. He must have been begging her to hold on, to lend him the money so he could go through with the plan. Little did she know, there was no plan. Not for her, at least. When he hung up, he turned to find me standing in the doorway, smiling. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice as sweet as honey. "Just work stuff," he mumbled, looking away. "Busy morning already," I said, crossing the room to pour myself a cup of coffee. "You're working so hard lately. I really appreciate it." He glanced at me, suspicious for a second, then relaxed. "Yeah, well, someone's got to make sure everything goes smoothly." "That's true," I said, sipping my coffee and smiling over the rim of the cup. "Just make sure you don't run yourself into the ground." He laughed, but it was hollow. I could see the cracks forming, the way his confidence was beginning to waver. He thought he was manipulating Jessica, using her money to make his grand escape from me. But in reality, he was the one being played, trapped in a game he didn't even know he was losing. And soon, he would learn the truth. The day I decided to confront Jessica felt almost surreal, as if I were living in some kind of twisted alternate reality. There was an odd sense of calm in my heart, a kind of detached clarity, like I was preparing for a business meeting rather than a showdown with the woman who had, knowingly or not, helped destroy my marriage. But I was beyond emotions at this point. Fury, heartbreak, they had already scorched through me, leaving only cold, sharp resolve. I waited for the perfect moment to strike. Mark had left for work that morning, kissing me on the cheek like he always did. It took every ounce of restraint not to slap his lips off his smug face. But I just smiled, watching him disappear out the door with that casual arrogance I had grown to despise. Once he was gone, I packed a small overnight bag for the kids, dropping them off at my mother's for the weekend. I had told her I needed some time to myself, and she didn't ask questions. Bless her, she was always my rock in times of chaos. I kissed them goodbye, knowing full well this weekend was going to be the tipping point. After that, I drove to Jessica's apartment. I had tracked her address weeks ago, through a carefully crafted combination of snooping and subtle questions thrown Mark's way. He had let enough slip to give me the details I needed. It wasn't a grand apartment like ours, but more of a modest studio loft, one of those places you rent temporarily while you wait for your real life to start. For Jessica, that real life was supposed to begin with Mark. It was a late afternoon when I arrived, the sun casting long shadows on the narrow street. I parked my car and sat in silence for a few moments, watching the door to her building, rehearsing the lines I might say. I wasn't planning on creating a scene. I didn't need to scream or cry. This wasn't about dramatic revenge. It was about closure, about letting her know that, no matter what they had planned, it wasn't going to work out the way she thought. I rang the buzzer. After a moment of static, her voice came through. "Hello? It's Sarah," I said calmly, Mark's wife. There was a long pause, the kind that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. She was probably standing there, frozen with shock, her mind spinning in disbelief. The seconds dragged on until I heard the buzzing sound of the door unlocking. "Come in," she finally said, her voice laced with confusion, maybe even fear. I could already imagine her heartbeat racing. I walked up the narrow staircase, feeling strangely light with every step, as though some part of me was already beginning to shed the weight of everything I had carried for too long. When I reached her door, it was already open. Jessica stood there, leaning against the frame, arms crossed defensively. She was younger than me by a few years, her hair perfectly styled, her makeup pristine. She was dressed casually, in a way that suggested she had been expecting Mark. But now, instead of her lover, she was facing me, the wife, the intruder in the life she thought she was building. "Sarah," she said cautiously, as though testing the waters. "I wasn't expecting you." "No," I replied with a smile, stepping inside her apartment without waiting for an invitation. "I'm sure you weren't." The room smelled faintly of lavender, and a soft light filtered through the blinds. It was a cozy space, far too comfortable for what was about to happen. Jessica followed me to the small kitchen, where I leaned against the counter, watching her with an almost clinical interest. Her confidence, the self-assured smile I had imagined, wasn't there. She was nervous, her eyes darting to the door as if she was debating whether she should make a run for it. "How did you find me?" she asked, her voice tight. I raised an eyebrow, amused by the question. "Oh, Jessica, please. Did you really think Mark could keep something like this hidden from me? I've known for a while." Her face paled, and she shifted her weight uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't mean for any of this." I cut her off, my voice sharp but calm. "Let's skip the pleasantries, shall we? You and Mark have been planning this for months. You think I don't know that? You think I didn't overhear your little conversation about selling my apartment?" I leaned forward slightly, watching the panic flicker in her eyes. "You were going to help him take it from me, weren't you?" She stammered, clearly unprepared for my directness. "I thought you knew." "Knew?" I laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "I knew everything, Jessica." I've known for weeks. While you two were busy plotting your little escape, I was busy making my own plans. And let me tell you something. It's not going to end the way you think it is." Her eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. "I sold the apartment last week." Jessica blinked, confusion washing over her face. "Sold it? But Mark said." "Mark said a lot of things, didn't he?" I interrupted. "He said we were selling the place together. He said you two were going to use the money for a new apartment. He probably told you he was only staying with me for a little while longer, right? That once the apartment was sold, everything would be different." She nodded, slowly, the realization beginning to sink in. "He did," she whispered. "Well," I said, crossing my arms, "he lied. The apartment was mine before we got married, and I sold it on my terms. It's gone, Jessica. And the money? It's already tied up in another property, one that Mark can't touch. So whatever dreams he sold you, whatever fantasy life you two were planning, it's over. There's nothing left for him to sell, and nothing left for you to take." I watched her crumble, the smugness that I had imagined she once carried now dissolving into something else. Fear, anger, desperation. It was almost sad to see, but I didn't feel sorry for her. Not even a little. "But he said," she sputtered, her voice barely above a whisper. "He promised." "I'm sure he did," I said, standing up straighter, feeling the power shift in the room. "But you see, Jessica, Mark is a liar. He's been lying to both of us. And now, he has nothing. No apartment, no money. Just you." She stood there, her face flushed with confusion and anger. I could see the wheels turning in her head, the slow realization that everything she had been working toward, everything she thought she was about to have, had been ripped away. I looked at my watch, then back at her. "I don't have much time, so let's cut to the chase. Mark is all yours now. I'm done with him. Enjoy your life together, what little of it there is left. But don't be surprised when he tries to squeeze you dry, because he's got nothing else to offer you." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I glanced back over my shoulder. "Oh, and one more thing. Tell Mark I'll see him in court. There are still some loose ends to tie up. Alimony, child support, the usual." I didn't wait for her response. I didn't need to. I walked out of her apartment, the door clicking shut behind me with a satisfying finality. As I stepped out into the fading daylight, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't revenge I had sought. It was freedom. And now, as I breathed in the cool evening air, I finally felt it. I was free. Mark could have his lies, his broken promises, his pathetic attempts to rebuild the life he thought he could create with Jessica. But he wouldn't have me, and he wouldn't have the life I had built. Not anymore. And that, I thought with a smile, was the real victory. The aftermath was unlike anything I had imagined. I thought that once I walked out of Jessica's apartment, it would all be over. The confrontation, the lies, the betrayal. But life is never that simple. There's always a ripple effect, a consequence for every action, every word spoken in anger or calm. And Mark? Mark was about to face the consequences of his greed, his deceit, and his complete underestimation of me. After that day, everything moved quickly. The sale of my apartment had already gone through, and I had moved my children into the new place I had secured in my mother's name. It was a 3-bedroom apartment on the other side of town, nothing fancy, but big enough for us. It was ours, untouched by the mess Mark had tried to drag me into. As for Mark, he was about to discover that he was standing on a sinking ship with no lifeboat in sight. The first real shock must have hit him when he came home that night. I imagined the scene clearly. Mark walking through the front door of our apartment, expecting me to be there with dinner ready or the kids playing in the living room. But instead, he found an empty shell. No signs of life, no laughter, no warmth. Just a cold, hollow space devoid of everything he thought he controlled. I had left the keys on the kitchen counter along with a single note. "It's done." He would have walked through every room, checking closets, drawers, anything that might tell him where I had gone. But there was nothing. He didn't deserve any more of my words. I had already said everything I needed to say in Jessica's apartment. Mark was alone now, standing in the mess of his own creation. That same night, I received a message from him. It was frantic, barely coherent. He wasn't angry at first. No, that would come later. His first instinct was fear. "Sarah, where are you? Please, we need to talk. I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Just come home, and we'll sort this out. We can fix this." I stared at the message, feeling nothing but a vague sense of pity. He still thought he could fix it, still believed he had some kind of power over me, that I would come crawling back, begging for an explanation, for his version of the truth. But I didn't respond. Silence was all I owed him. The next morning, the real fire began. My lawyer had been preparing the divorce papers for weeks. The documents outlined everything: alimony, child support, the division of assets. Of course, the apartment was already out of Mark's reach, but that didn't stop him from trying to fight for it. He had no idea how much I had stacked the deck against him. He thought he could lawyer up, throw a few threats around, and somehow come out of this with half of everything. He underestimated the power of the truth, and the truth was that Mark had nothing to stand on. The court proceedings were quick and brutal. His attempts to claim part of the apartment were laughable. It had been mine before our marriage, and he had no legal right to any of it. His lawyers tried to argue that because we had lived there as a family, he deserved a portion, but the judge shot that down in a heartbeat. Then came the issue of child support. Mark had been so busy trying to weasel his way out of paying that he hadn't realized how deep he'd already sunk. His infidelity, his financial manipulation, the lies he told me. It all came spilling out in the courtroom, exposed for everyone to see. I had kept meticulous records of everything: bank statements, text messages, even his pathetic attempts to manipulate Jessica into giving him money. Jessica wasn't there in person, of course. I doubted she could handle the humiliation of being dragged into Mark's mess, but her name came up often enough, a shadow that hovered over every conversation, every argument he made. She had been his pawn, his means to an end, and now even she couldn't save him. Mark's face during the trial was a sight to behold. At first, he had tried to act confident, as if he could still charm his way out of this. But as the evidence piled up against him, his bravado faded, replaced by a mixture of disbelief and rage. He kept looking at me like I was a stranger, as if he couldn't comprehend that the woman he had so easily dismissed was now the one tearing down everything he had built. The ruling came swiftly. Mark was ordered to pay alimony and child support, his attempts to dodge responsibility crushed beneath the weight of his lies. I walked out of that courtroom with my head held high, knowing that I had not only protected myself, but also my children. We were free, and Mark? He was left with nothing but his rented apartment and his broken promises. In the weeks that followed, I heard whispers about Mark's life falling apart. Word spread that Jessica had left him shortly after the trial, unable to stomach the reality of what he had become. Apparently, she had lent him a significant amount of her savings, believing his promises that they would be buying a new apartment together. When she realized there was no apartment, no future, she walked out. It was poetic justice in a way. Mark had used her the same way he had tried to use me, and now both of his worlds had crumbled. He was living in a cheap, run-down studio apartment, struggling to pay his bills while juggling the reality of child support and alimony payments. The man who had once thought he could have it all was now a shell of his former self. And as for Jessica, I didn't know where she went, and I didn't care. She had played her part in Mark's downfall, but she was never really a threat to me. In the end, she was just another victim of his lies, another casualty in his game. As I settled into my new life, a strange sense of peace began to wash over me. My new apartment felt like a sanctuary, a place untouched by the past. The kids were adjusting well, happier now that they were away from the tension that had once filled our home. And me? I was finally free of Mark's shadow. There were moments when I would catch myself thinking back to the early days of our marriage, to the man I thought I had loved. But those moments were fleeting, ghosts of a time that no longer held any power over me. Mark had been a lesson, a painful one, but a necessary one. He had shown me what I was capable of, how strong I could be when it mattered most. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the sunset dip below the horizon, my phone buzzed. It was another message from Mark, one of many that he had sent since the divorce was finalized. "I'm sorry, Sarah. Please, can we talk? I made a mistake. I just want to make things right." I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling nothing but a distant sense of pity for the man he had become. Then, without a second thought, I deleted the message and turned my phone off. It was over. The aftermath had come and gone, and I had survived the storm. Now, it was time to live, to rebuild, to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready.